Hi, and welcome back to Gender Studies. Now, in this chapter on gendered close relationships, we'll be covering quite a bit of stuff in this particular chapter. Now, starting with some of the dynamics of close relationships, most notable personal relationships, okay? So within these relationships, we will explore masculinity and femininity and how they're experienced and expressed. Now, lastly, we will consider gendered patterns in friendships and romantic relationships. So we have a lot to cover, so let's get right into it. As I mentioned, we're going to begin with meaningful personal relationships. Now, personal relationships are those which partners depend upon each other for various things, ranging from material assistance to affection. Partners regard each other as unique individuals who cannot be replaced. So we're not just talking about all your friends, we're talking about a select few. Now, of the many relationships that we form, only a few become really personal. Research demonstrates that people often choose friends and romantic partners who are similar to themselves in terms of age, gender, race, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status. LGBTQ individuals are more likely to refer to friends as family. Now, research can identify two models of relationships, and as you may expect, they are divided along binary lines, male and female models of personal relationships. Now, the differences in the masculine and female orientations to close relationships often reflect male and female approaches to relationships generally. Now, some scholars argue that the masculine approach to relationships are inferior to the feminine ones, while others think the two styles are equally valid. So let's look at them and see for ourselves. The first, we're going to start with the male deficit model, and it suggests that the feminine individuals are the relationship experts, and they view the feminine way of forming and maintaining relationships as the right way to engage in intimacy, and that the masculine style of building and maintaining relationships is just not adequate. The male deficit model views personal, emotional self-disclosure as a key to close relationships. Emotional talk is seen as the most important part of intimacy. Much academic and popular sentiment maintains that men are less able than women to express emotions and to care. Now, these approaches hold that since self-disclosure is so important to intimacy, men and boys' friendships are less intimate than women's and girls', and that men emphasize activities to avoid intimacy. Media often represents men as emotionally lacking and women as naturally adept at relationships. Then there's the second model for males, and there's another one. It's called the male model, which is an alternative path model. The alternative paths model asserts that there are different routes to creating and sustaining close relationships that are equally valid for creating closeness. Now, while this model agrees with the male deficit model that socialization is the source of these differences between the feminine and masculine styles of relating, it departs in two very different ways. First, it doesn't presume masculine people lack feelings or emotional depth. And second, it argues that the masculine people express closeness but in an alternative way. The alternative path model suggests that masculine socialization discourages masculine individuals from expressing their feelings verbally and limiting their chances to practice emotional disclosure. The alternative path model also argues that masculine people do express closeness, but they do it very differently. They do so in a way that is different, but equally valid ways of the feminine people. This model also challenges the research that was used to justify the male deficit model, noting that these studies defined and measured men's closeness using the feminine ruler, and that judged men's relationships based on the feminine norms. So there's an example of it being flipped from what it normally might be viewed as, women meeting the masculine norm. So instead of self-disclosure, masculine people tend to express their closeness by doing things together. This does not mean, however, that they don't self-disclose or engage in emotional talk. Expectations and behavior in close relationships can also vary in response to the friend's gender. The more information a man shares on social networking site, the more likely a viewer is to pursue social interactions with them. But women, the opposite is true. Both men and women judge a friend more harshly for betraying confidence if that friend is female. So let's move subtly into gendered styles of friendship. And we're going to start with the feminine friendships. There are many similarities between the friendships. Regardless of sex or gender, most individuals value close friends and invest in them. Most people use both feminine and masculine approaches to friendship. Women are more likely to communicate face to face. Men usually interact side by side. Women's friendships tend to be built through dialogue, typically about personal feelings and experiences, fears, problems in the daily lives and activities. Talk is the primary way to build and enrich friendships that exist as an evolving dialogue. A majority of women talk as the primary way to build and enrich friendships. Consequently, many share personal feelings and experiences, fears, problems, and what's going on in each other's lives. Women tend to maintain a higher expectation for their friends in matters related to trust, and intimacy and communication tends to be empathetic, expressive, and supportive. Because women are generally socialized to be attentive, emotionally supportive, and caring, it can be difficult for women friends to cope with feelings of envy and competitiveness towards friends. Female friends often discuss the qualities and dimensions of their relationship explicitly. Women's friendships are often characterized by breadth that introduces friends to many different aspects of each other's lives. Alternatively, men's friendships tend to center on doing activities together, such as engaging in sports, watching games, or other shared activities. Closeness is in the doing describes the way that many men build friendships. Many men perceive talking as one way rather than the only and best way to build relationships. When they do talk, they tend to be more about their activities. Men tend to seek companions rather than confidants in their friendships. Men's friendships may have an instrumental focus in which men do things to help one another out. Now, this may also be may take into form of divisionary activities when faced with problems, rather than explicit, expressive conversations about them. Men tend to talk indirectly about their serious feelings with other men. Often serious emotional issues are shrouded in a joke talk or some other form of avoidance and hedging. Men's relationships may involve covert intimacy in which affection is signaled through teasing and friendly competition and playful punches, etc., where it involves an element of close and haptics. You remember that from nonverbal. Men's friendships tend to be narrower in scope than women's friendships, with different friends for various spheres of interests. So what about the friendships between men and women? Well, because of the high emphasis we place on gender in our culture, women and men may see each other as, more in the sexual terms as opposed to just friends. And for many women, a primary benefit of friendships with men is less emotionally intense relationship. Men report getting more emotional support and release from their friendships with women. Women also report getting more emotional support from their female friends as well. Now, both sexes report that their friendships with women are closer than those with men. And this may be why both sexes seek out their women friends in times of stress. Now, one of the bigger areas that this topic will cover is the gendered romantic relationships. And we're going to look at a variety here. So the heterosexual romantic relationships tend to follow a very typical script in which traditional gender roles are emphasized. So we'll begin with developing romantic intimacy, and intimacy is, by our terms here, not quite just a physical intimacy. Intimacy is the experience of being able to share thoughts, fears, and ideas, and dreams and hopes, untethered and not judged. It's a closeness that we refer to when we talk about intimacy. Heterosexual men and women seek fairly traditional masculine and feminine partners, when men prioritizing physical attractiveness and sexiness, and women prioritizing status and success. Now, most heterosexual couples conform to a script in which men take a more active role in planning dates. Gay men and lesbians are less likely to conform to any particular standard script. Research indicates that men actually tend to fall in love faster and harder than women. Men tend to express love in more impulsive and sexual ways than women do. Women whose styles of loving tend to be more pragmatic and friendship focused. Now, heterosexual men are far more likely to regard sexual infidelity as more distressing and than emotional infidelity. Attitudes towards sexual behavior, while less rigid than in the past, still indicates that women who express sexuality openly or have non-traditional relationships are judged more harshly than men are. Cisgender and heterosexual women tend to engage in sex for intimacy and commitment reasons, while cisgender heterosexual men are more often motivated by lust and physical pleasure. Lesbians place a greater premium on monogamy. Gay men report greater comfort with open relationships. And you're seeing the complexity and the fluidity of gender here. Women, regardless of sexual orientation, are more likely than men to focus on relationship dynamics. Committed heterosexual relationships tend to continue to reflect cultural values and beliefs, with men at the head of the family and the primary wage earner, and women as primarily in charge of domestic aspects of the relationship. Now again, we are seeing gender fluidity in terms of some of the stereotypes not holding true as much anymore. Gay and lesbian relationships are not bound by roles in the way that heterosexual relationships tend to be. Their commitments often resemble the best friend relationships, with the added aspects of the sexuality and romance. So let's look at some of these gendered patterns in these committed relationships, and we'll look at gendered modes of expressing affection. Women tend to create and express closeness through personal talk and self-disclosure. Men rely more on, as we've mentioned, the instrumental displays of affection, the doing. For women, ongoing conversations about feelings and daily activities is primary way to express personal relationships. But men find it a pointless talk unless there's a problem. There's a cultural bias towards feminine forms of expressing love, often not recognizing the instrumental displays of affection. For example, I had done some work as a counselor, and some couples would dialogue about these sort of dynamics, and she's saying, well, he never says he loves me. He says, I do all these things to show you that I love you. They're not, she needs to hear it, him say the words. He just needs her to recognize the things that he's doing. They think they're at odds when in fact they're both expressing love, but just do it differently. Lesbian and gay couples, they may share perspectives about how to communicate affection. Lesbians generally build on the most expressive and nurturing communication climates of any type of couple. So if we look at the gendered preferences for autonomy and connection, do we need our relationships to be separate and independent, or do they need to be connected? Well, both masculine and feminine individuals desire personal freedom and a feeling of interconnectedness. It's a tough balance. Feminine individuals are socialized to focus on their relationships, generally are comfortable with greater levels of connectivity. Masculine individuals are socialized towards more independence. Typically, they want greater autonomy. No wonder we have some challenges. The differences in desire for autonomy and connection can lead to problems in relationships when behaviors are interpreted from different perspectives. This may lead to the demand withdrawal pattern, in which one partner feels distant, so attempts to engage attempts to engage in close personal talks, leaving the other feeling stifled by the discussion. So it creates these at odds within relationships. More damaging, though, is the tendency to interpret each other's behavior according to gendered rules that don't apply to the other's behavior. Respect for different needs of autonomy and connectedness is essential to the successful relationship. You're looking at, for the most part, the value and importance of ongoing communication. Let's next move into the gendered responsibility for relational health. Who looks after the relationship? Well, it varies. Lesbian couples tend to be very sensitive to the interpersonal dynamics and are interested in talking about the relationship and working through problems. Heterosexual couples, they do not distribute the responsibility for relationship health as well. Both men and women tend to assume women should take responsibility for the relational maintenance of the relationship. Expectations for one partner's responsibilities for ensuring relational health can lead to problems. Any relationship involves two people. Both ought to be involved in the relational health. Research shows greater satisfaction has been identified in relationships where the relationship maintenance is shared. Now, another important element in relationships is the gendered power dynamics. Since historically the person who makes the most money in the heterosexual relationship has tended to be given the most power, men's traditional breadwinner role has afforded them the greater power in many relationships. This dynamic tends not to be present in gay and lesbian relationships. Tension may arise over the role of the primary breadwinner, particularly for those who subscribe to the traditional gender roles, but whose paychecks violate these expectations. People who adhere to the traditional gender role views in marriages are more likely to experience a decrease in self-esteem and marital satisfaction. If the woman earns more money, that will create some potential problems. In a heterosexual relationship, women tend to do more work in the home, including the housework and caregiving, than men do. Now, this is true even when both partners work and even when the woman earns considerably more money than the man does. It's called the second shift. Gay and lesbian couples are more likely than heterosexual couples to divide childcare and household labor more equally between the partners. Men who share in childcare tend to have less conflict with their relationship and have more satisfying sex. One key reason in unequal contributions to domestic labor is the gender ideology. Men and women with more traditional beliefs are more likely to perceive it as appropriate for women to do more of the domestic labor. So people from my generation are more likely to see that as the way things should be. Those of you born after, say, 1980 might have a different view of that. Women who don't perceive desirable alternatives to their current relationship have little leverage in persuading their partners to participate more. A commitment to equity by both partners will affect how they divide domestic chores. That's clear. Gender socialization teaches girls to perform more traditionally feminine tasks and have developed those skills as an adult. Millennial men have more egalitarian views related to gender, family, and careers within a marriage, and that's encouraging in terms of that gender fluidity. As mentioned a little bit earlier, and I referenced the term second shift, women's duties of taking care of the home and family members after arriving home from work tend to be very taxing, routine, repetitive, and not all that rewarding. The domestic work women do is often more taxing and less gratifying than that done by men who are more repetitive, routine, and constrained by the deadlines. Reasons why men and women engage in differing amounts of domestic labor are complex, and they include the adherence to, as I've mentioned, the traditional gender ideology of a woman access to relationship alternatives and to the dispute and for the desire of equity. Because many women consider becoming a mother to be a choice, they may assume they are responsible to meet all of the demands related to that choice. Although men continue to do less domestic labor than women, men's participation in the domestic sphere has been increasing considerably since the 1960s. Women have the psychological responsibility for the planning and remembering of things that need to be done, increases the burdens of that second shift duty. Consequences of the second shift include stress, fatigue, illness, and resentment. Heterosexual couples who share equally in running the home and raising a family are more satisfied. Another indicator of power dynamics is how couples manage conflict. Masculine individuals tend to use the unilateral strategies to engage in and avoid conflicts through strategies such as issuing ultimatums. Either you do this or do that. Refusing to discuss an issue or to assert that the problem is being blown out of proportion. Feminine individuals tend to employ indirect strategies when they do engage in conflict or defer to compromise to reduce the tension. Gendered power dynamics are also reflected in patterns of violence and abuse. Acts of violence tend to be inflicted most typically by men who have been socialized into the masculine identities and cuts across race, ethnicity, and class lines. Violent behavior is a product of gender, not sex. One study reported that both male and female abusers tend to have a masculine gendered orientation. Well, that brings us to the end of gendered close relationships. Next week, we're going to be exploring gendered organizational communication. If you're graduating and working for somebody in an organization or a company, this will apply to you. All right, everybody, good luck, and we'll see you next week. Bye now.